I didn't. There's no way I didn't do it. No way. Why did you guys come in and say you were searching for an assault?
This is George Hewley. In 2010, he beat his 22-year-old girlfriend to death in a drunken fit of jealous rage. But Yardley Love had already broken up with him. So what triggered his brutal attack? And how did the police get him to confess?
Tell me she's not dead. Tell me she's not dead though, please.
This is the full story of Yardley Love's murder and George Hewley's descent into madness. Many people think children from broken marriages are left broken too, traumatized by fights, discontent, and not having two parents. But psychologists today agree it's better to have one parent than to witness a toxic relationship on a daily basis. You might say, sure, but what about financial problems when there's only one parent? In George Hewley's case, money certainly wasn't a problem after his parents' divorce. He was born George Wesley Hewley V on September 17, 1987, in Washington, D.C., to parents George Wesley Hewley IV and Marta Murphy. Notice the very fancy name on his father's side. George was the heir of Gallagher and Hewley Lumberyard, built by his great-great-grandfather in 1912. The younger generations then invested in racehorsing and bought a 1,000-unit apartment complex. By the time George was born, they had enough money to afford a lavish lifestyle and an excellent education for him. During junior high, George attended Mater D High School, a private boys' school in Maryland. Then he went over to Landon All-Boys School, where he realized his passion for sports. He became an All-American lacrosse player, and during his senior year at Landon, he also became the quarterback for the school's football team. By the time he graduated, he'd won the school several trophies, both for lacrosse and football. He knew he wanted to continue athletics during university too. So, George enrolled at the University of Virginia and joined their lacrosse team. But within a semester, he'd become the teen clown. Sure, he would throw lavish parties at his family's beach house in North Carolina, and all his teammates were invited. He would even take his teammates on yacht rides. But he wasn't putting enough effort into practice. And sometimes he wouldn't attend practice at all. He just wasn't taking anything seriously anymore. In 2007, he was arrested and charged with underage possession of alcohol in Florida, where he'd gone to stay at his family's other vacation home. A year later, an officer arrested him while he was stumbling into traffic on a very busy road. He was extremely drunk and completely resistant to the officer. When she told him to get a ride home unless he wanted to come to the police station, he shouted racist and sexist comments at her. Then he screamed, "I'll kill you. I'll kill all of y'all. I'm not going to jail." He ended up tasered and driven to the police station. Wonderful personality, right? With his parents' seemingly endless cash, he bought himself a lawyer who stated he was too drunk to remember insulting the police officer. But at school, he would brag left and right about the incident, quoting every little detail and obscene comment he made. Somehow, he managed not to get expelled from school. Perhaps if he did, he never would have met Yardley Love, but he did. Yardley Reynolds Love was born on July 17, 1987. She was exactly 2 months older than George. She grew up in Baltimore, Maryland with her parents, John and Sharon. And in many ways, she followed a similar route to George. She attended an all-girls private school called Notre Dame Preparatory School, where she joined the varsity lacrosse and field hockey teams. And in 2006, she was an all-country lacrosse player. The following year, she was admitted to the University of Virginia, where she majored in political science and minored in Spanish. But of course, she also joined the university's lacrosse team. And it was there during her freshman year that she met George. The two seemed to hit it off immediately. After all, they had a lot in common, from their wealthy families to their prestigious educations and passion for sports. But they also had their differences. For starters, George was a much bigger fan of getting drunk at parties than Yardley. And about a year into their relationship, she started having second thoughts about him. In fact, even though George and Yardley dated for 2 years, most of the time this was an off and on relationship, thanks to George's drunken, violence. In 2009, one of George's teammates walked Yardley home one evening. George couldn't get it out of his mind that the two also kissed when they said goodbye, even though both he and Yardley denied it. So one night, George broke into his teammate's home and attacked him viciously while he was sleeping. Eventually, the boys talked it out, and the next day, they assured their coach that everything was fine. A few months later, in the spring of 2010, both Yardley and George's teams won their games, so they were celebrating with a party. George celebrated by jumping on top of Yardley and choking her. He was so violent that her friends had to physically rescue her. That evening, they drove her home to Baltimore. That's when she told her friends their relationship was over. She was done with George's aggressiveness, impulsiveness, and absolute lack of empathy. But as April came to an end, Yardley's friends kept seeing her interacting with George on campus. Perhaps they were just friends, or perhaps George wasn't done with the relationship. On May 1st, 2010, George's team won the final game of the season, and Yardley attended the celebration party, just like most of her team. George's mom, Martha, was also there, and Yardley spoke to her that night. George didn't speak to Yardley as much as Marta, but he would join the conversation every now and then, and everything looked normal from afar. But nothing was normal. George's mind had become a truly dark place, and Yardley was about to pay the ultimate price. At 2:15 a.m., Yardley's roommate returned to their off-campus home. First, she saw that someone had broken into Yardley's bedroom. As she entered the bedroom, she was surprised to see Yardley sleeping in a very strange position on her bed. How drunk could she be? She thought. So when she tried to wake her up, she got a knot in her stomach. Finally, she was realizing something very bad had happened. Yardley had blood in her hair and her right eye was black. And as hard as her roommate shook her, she just wouldn't wake up. Terrified, the roommate called 911 and said Yardley might have suffered an alcohol overdose. She didn't know how Yardley got into the state, but she surely couldn't imagine that someone had attacked her violently. When the paramedics arrived at the scene, they tried all they could to revive Yardley, but at 2:47 a.m., she was pronounced dead. 6 minutes later, homicide investigator Lisa Reeves arrived at the scene. By 4 a.m., she had her first person of interest. Indeed, all Lisa needed was to talk to the people who knew Yardley to understand her troublesome relationship with George. Nobody knew what their last conversation was about or when it had taken place, but Yardley's friends knew she'd been calling it quits for ages. Still, she kept coming back to George, and George never changed his alcoholic or violent behavior towards her.
Everybody watched the relationship. People were really troubled by it. They were scared for her. Nobody knew what to do.
For the last time, Yardley ended the relationship just 9 days before her murder. So Lisa knew she had to speak to George. Before sunrise, Lisa knocked at George's door just minutes away from Yardley's apartment. Lisa was dressed in civilian clothes and said nothing about Yardley's death. She just told George that she was conducting important research that he would be very useful for. So she invited him to the sheriff's office, and he came willingly, even though he put on a show for being woken up so early in the morning. Inside the car, Lisa looked at George's hands. That's when she noticed scratches and bruises. She knew he was the main suspect. So when they began the interrogation, Lisa cut to the chase.
I know I introduced myself to you at your house, but my name is Lisa Reeves. Today's date is May the 3rd, 2010. The current time is, I can't tell on that one, 7:52,
I
okay?
draw with papers too.
What's that?
I draw with papers still right now.
George kept an arrogant attitude initially, behaving like the cops were bothering him for no reason. In fact, he had no idea that his ex-girlfriend had died because of his brutal attack. And it took a while until he figured out just why he was inside the interrogation room. But Lisa informed him that she was a detective and she was conducting an investigation.
You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can be used against you in court. You have the right to talk to a lawyer before questioning and have one present during questioning. If you cannot afford a lawyer, one will be provided for you. And if you're willing to talk to us now, you have the right to stop talking anytime.
Here's an ironic twist. George was rich. Very rich. His family could have easily provided him with a top lawyer who would have taught him how to construct his answers and dodge the traps set by the police. He might have even been able to avoid jail time. But the detective quickly built rapport with George, making him feel safe with her. Before long, He signed the Miranda rights and started talking. No lawyer present. It would be this confession that would reveal the truth behind Yardley's murder and their terrible relationship.
Let's kind of start. I'm going to kind of ask you some questions, and like I said, we'll explain things a little bit later. Tell me about your day yesterday.
Played golf with our parents. It was a father-son. Good event. I went to dinner with my dad and my two buddies, and then went home, went to the bar for like a little while. Then I went over to talk to Yardley.
When Lisa asked George about her, he referred to her as his former girlfriend. He even mentioned that he understood she was the topic of the investigation, even though Lisa hadn't revealed anything yet. This made him look even more suspicious.
I was like, Yardley, and she was like already totally freaked out because of what she did this past.
George was having a hard time finding his words, but what he meant to say was that Yardley had slept with a fellow lacrosse player of George's a few days before. Of course, they had already broken up, but this didn't sit well with George at all.
She was already freaking out. You can't come in, you can't come in. And I was like, I'm just trying to talk to you.
Already, George had confirmed he knew he'd done something bad to Yardley and that he broke into her apartment. By quoting her saying he couldn't come in, he admitted to trespassing, if not breaking and entering. Then George said Yardley was scared of him and backed into the wall while she sat in her bed. Then she became aggressive, he says. She
started being getting all aggressive after this, and so I was like, all right, chill out, and shook her a little bit.
Shook her a little bit? Really? According to George, he kept telling her that all he wanted to do was talk, and she kept being overly defensive or aggressive about it. Almost like he was the victim in this situation. As if first she cheated on him, then she wouldn't let him discuss the events.
And she started being freaking out, and I was like, listen, I'm not here to do anything. I'm here to talk to you about everything that's ensued in the past week. And she was started being no, hitting her head, stop, she was in the corner, I was sitting on the bed, I was like, stop,
Not only does George use the word more than possibly anyone, showing either a very poor vocabulary or extreme stress, but he also tells a bogus story. First, he begins mimicking how Yardley hit the wall, but changes mid-sentence, saying instead she was freaking out. Then he claims that she slammed her own head against the wall just because she was freaked out by George's presence in her room. First of all, why was she so scared of him? Second of all, what? Who would ever believe someone would hit their own head so hard as to cause fatal head trauma? For Lisa, this just meant George confessed to knowing Yardley had severe head trauma. But as she asked him what happened next, he insisted that she kept banging her head on the wall, and even that he tried to stop her.
I was holding her arms and stuff, but I never struck her, I never hit her in the face or anything. I was just we need to talk, and she was so what's the word? Flopping a fish out of the water.
Then he says Yardley kept telling him to leave. So why didn't he leave if she asked him to so many times?
I was a little bit persistent because of the situation. My former girlfriend who something happened last week, and I was all right, well.
Here are 3 things George said within 3 minutes. I was holding her, I was a little bit persistent, I was wrestling her on the floor. No amount of years in prestigious schools taught George to be cautious or carefully construct his sentences. He basically implicated himself as a trespasser and attacker, all while believing he was justifying himself in the situation. He was just a jealous boyfriend who wanted to talk to his ex, right? She was just behaving exaggerately, so he needed to contain her. Now, Lisa could start adding pressure on George, leading him to contradict his previous statements and draw him into a corner for a full confession. George claimed that he stepped easily into her house as the front door was open. Then he said he walked into her bedroom too as her door was unlocked. But remember the break-in signs at the crime scene?
How'd you get through the door?
Her door or the front door?
Her door.
Actually, it might have been locked.
It was.
Yeah. Actually, yeah.
Just be honest with me.
Yeah,
How'd you
no,
get
yeah,
through
it was actually locked,
Yeah.
Because I think I put a hole.
Yeah. You punched a hole through the door.
Pretty sure actually now.
But George couldn't answer why he did that. He kept going back to Yardley behaving hysterically. So Lisa moved the conversation towards his motive. Why was he so desperate to talk to her that he punched a hole through the door? Finally, George opened up.
She went to Carolina and hooked up with someone Sunday when we were still trying to figure out things. And I was over there like to talk, I was like, this is outrageous. Because I was trying to make everything better.
As he went over his story about their interaction again, he changed his story. Now he was holding Yardley when she started banging her head against the wall.
Like, come on, like, you know, and that's when she was like wiggle and like get away and like, you know, like hide get in the corner, like really like aggressive, like defensively almost. And then she ended. I think she was back in bed, and I left. I was like, this is not going anywhere.
But the detective knew how to extract the meaningful bits of information from his outrageous rant. So she asked him how Yardley got back in bed.
We stood up, and I tossed her. I pushed her onto the bed. I was like, go to bed. Like, I'll talk to you later.
What about choking Yardley?
I may have grabbed her a little bit by the neck when we were like. But I never like strangled her.
Okay.
But I mean, during the whole like commotion, you know, like I might have grabbed her neck, but I never was like strangling her.
Okay.
Sure, grabbing someone's neck doesn't mean strangling them. Then George admitted to taking Yardley's laptop from her room as collateral. He wanted her to contact him again to return her laptop so that he could tell her off once more about her post-breakup cheating. Now, Lisa had to get the final confession and reveal to George that Yardley had in fact died. So she asked him if he checked on her or called her for help after attacking her.
I didn't think it was like, I didn't think that she was like in need of like going to the emergency room. She just got, I made a blood.
What do you think that?
I don't know. I mean,
Didn't you say when you were, and correct me if I'm wrong, when you were shaking her, her head was hitting the wall?
Well, that was in the beginning. That was initially when I walked in. Like she was like up in the corner, like saying, "Get out of here!" Like you know, like this.
George insisted that he never really struck or hit Yardley and that she banged her head of her own volition. So Lisa went back to his statement that he was angry at her for sleeping with someone else. That's when she asked him to see his phone and check his messages to her. George himself had said he'd sent her some nasty messages before his final visit to her apartment.
We didn't say them.
They were like, I guess what you call like an ongoing conversation, an ongoing like instant message, and it's gone.
See how Lisa grabbed his phone and put it to the side? Now it was evidence. There was no way George could delete his messages to Yardley. When Lisa mentioned his bruises and scratches, George said they were all from lacrosse, even though Lisa pointed out that they were fresh injuries and that he wore padded gloves for lacrosse.
Yeah, you're right. That was your leg.
Yeah.
How'd you get all the bruising on your hand then?
This is all from lacrosse.
That's when the other detective, Ed, stepped in with questions about their breakup.
Why did you guys break up exactly? Why?
Why?
Yeah.
Well, we are not from the same area.
Right.
And she wants to move to New York, and I'm not exactly sure what I'm doing yet, but I'd like to move to San Francisco.
Yeah, you guessed. He never mentioned his alcohol or violence issues as reasons Yardley had. Here's how the two detectives finally cornered George. Ed asked if Yardley was screaming or shouting while he was wrestling with her. he said no.
I mean, if I'm cracking my head in the wall, I'm gonna be saying, "Ow."
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, she was not screaming.
Yeah.
She should have been, probably, I mean, maybe.
Wait, what?
She should have been, probably, I mean, maybe.
This was the perfect time for Lisa to step in and reveal why George was actually being arrested.
She's dead. You killed her, George. You killed her.
She's dead?
I think you knew that already.
No, I did not.
George really did not understand the gravity of the situation until that moment. In fact, he rarely understood the gravity of his actions until that moment. Throughout his teenage and adult life, his violent, drunken outbursts were protected by his family, friends, or lawyers. He never really had to face consequences, bar the time or times Yardley broke up with him. But he didn't accept that either. Now, hours after committing murder, he was coming to terms with it.
How the f*** is she dead?
Because you killed her, George.
How the f*** is she dead?
Because you killed her.
George was stuck in a loop, repeating the same questions over and over again. So Ed stepped in, painting a clear scenario that George could confirm.
You went in there to talk with her, but it got out of control, right, George?
But George wasn't ready to accept the reality.
The alcohol got a hold of you. You kicked in her door. She started to fight with you. You punched her in the head, or you cracked.
She's not dead.
You cracked her head.
Dead.
You cracked her head in the window or in the wall.
Not dead.
She is.
She's not dead.
I ain't BSing you right now. It's serious.
Until now, George was talking. Now he was in pure denial.
I didn't. There's no way I didn't do it. No way.
He didn't say anything useful, but he'd said enough. So Lisa and Ed handcuffed George and charged him with murder.
Tell me she's not dead. Tell me she's not dead, though. Please. Will you tell me she's not dead?
Relax.
Please, will you tell me
You
she's
know what?
not
I wish
dead?
I could tell you that, George. 22-year-old. 22. And her life is done.
There's no way. There's no way. There's no way. I do not believe it. I do not believe it.
Finally, he broke down in tears too.
She's not dead. I know she's not dead. I know 100 million % she's not dead. I did.
When he finally relaxed and reality kicked in, he asked the $1 million question.
Okay, what do I do now? Go to jail?
Yeah.
George's trial was going to be an easy one. Just look at the few well-curated seconds from his interrogation.
She's like, no, like, get away from me. You have to leave, you have to leave, you have to leave. I was like a little bit persistent. I
Is she
mean,
screaming?
she should have been.
But before his trial, George spent 2 years in jail, held without bond after he pleaded not guilty to murder.
Well, testimony is now underway in the murder trial of the former UVA lacrosse player accused of killing his ex-girlfriend.
When he appeared at the trial, George was thin, quiet, and apathetic. His attitude was very different from that at the time of his arrest. During his trial, an infuriating twist was revealed. George acted like the victim of a cheating girlfriend. But not only had Yardley broken up with him, he was openly flirting with 3 women on his phone on the days before the murder. In other words, he had serious double standards, and several people would testify against him, confirming his penchant for drunken violence. George's lacrosse teammates testified to witnessing George strangling Yardley months before her murder. His other teammate, well, he was attacked in his own bed after George suspected him of kissing Yardley. Then there was the testimony from her neighbors.
The noise was so loud, this was such a violent death that they heard it downstairs, 2 separate witnesses, and it sounded like a stereo crashing to the ground.
Here's a truly tragic twist.
One medical expert revealed in the courtroom for the very first time that following Yardley Love's brutal beating, had George Hughley or anyone else called for help, she might have survived.
Apparently, Yardley was alive for 2 whole hours before succumbing to the head trauma. She could have been saved if only someone had come home sooner. If only George had the guts to call an ambulance. George's defense attorney only had one argument, that George never went to Yardley's place with intent to kill. It was a tragic accident made a reality through his alcohol consumption. That didn't really stand with the jury. George Hughley V was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to 26 years behind bars. That's when he addressed Yardley's mother and sister. "I miss her and I think about her every day. I would do anything to take back that night. I take responsibility for what happened to her, and I should have never gone over to her apartment that night." George's lawyer pleaded for the sentence to be halved.
The jury in this case recommended 26 years. The judge changed it to 23, probably a small difference, but why would he do that?
It's surprising, isn't it, considering this is a woman who was beaten to death in her own bed.
With the credit that he gets for already spending time in prison before the trial, and with good behavior, George could be out in 2030. Still, his family thinks he got a sentence way too harsh for what he actually did.
I believed our criminal justice system works, and the criminal justice system gets it right, but it doesn't always get it right. He had absolutely no intent to hurt Yardley. Yardley was his best friend.
Yeah, he was just drunk, right? Not to state the obvious, but being drunk or high is not an excuse or justification for his actions. George was drunk and aggressive, and he broke into her room to express his anger at her. He didn't realize he killed her until his fateful interrogation, but this doesn't diminish his responsibility. The Love family lost their daughter and will have to live with this emptiness forever. Today, George is at a prison in Richmond. He will be in his mid-40s at his release, with a chance to start afresh and reconsider his aggressive attitude. Hopefully, no one will suffer Yardley's fate again.
She said, "You're not Charles. I don't know who you are, what you did with Charles, but I can murder you now."
We're gathering together as saints, as brothers and sisters, and preparing for the second coming of Christ.
This is Lori Vallow Daybell. In 2018, she met her fifth husband, Chad Daybell. A year later, they killed her children, her ex-husband, and his ex-wife. And then they went on vacation. Then she made silly jokes with the police.
How long have you lived here?
Like 3 weeks.
Oh, geez. Yeah, okay.
That's why the neighbors don't know us.
Gotcha.
Like, hi neighbor, sorry.
Yeah, I know. Very creepy. Let's explore how Lori Vallow went from a beauty queen who always talked about how much she loved her kids to a doomsday cult fanatic who happily took her youngest children's lives. But before we go on, I must warn you. Today, we'll discuss violence, murder, and extreme violence toward children. This is your chance to turn back. Today's case will take us from the southern United States all the way up to Idaho. But before we get to chilly Rexburg, let's begin in sunny San Bernardino, California. Lori Noreen Cox was born to Barry and Janice on June 26, 1973, but she grew up in a family way larger than three. Lori had three sisters, Stacy, Laura, and Summer, and her two brothers, Alex and Ada. Her family had deep roots in the Church of Latter-day Saints. Growing up in a time when marriage and kids was the norm, Lori began her own family pretty early on. When she was 19, she married her high school boyfriend, Nelson. But within a year, they were divorced. 2 years later, she married her second husband, William. Together, they had a son, Colby Ryan, born in 1996. 2 years later, once more, the couple would break up. In 2001, Lori married her third husband, Joseph Ryan. On September 24, 2002, Tylee Ryan was born, Joseph's first child and Lori's first daughter. But lo and behold, by 2004, Lori would divorce Joseph too. But 3 divorces by the age of 30 wouldn't faze Lori. She would marry twice more. And it would only get messier. Lori had confided in her brother Alex that Joseph had been abusive to her. So Alex set out to punish Joseph. He was arrested and sentenced to 3 months in prison after he tased Joseph and threatened to kill him. As you're about to find out, Lori had a very strange relationship with Alex. He was the eldest brother of the Cox family, and when they were kids, he was often in charge of the house, while the parents would be on weeks-long vacations in Hawaii. Then, when Lori was in junior high, she told a friend that Alex wanted to have sex with her. While it's unclear if that happened or not, Alex remained obsessed with his little sister, even into his 40s and 50s. He was extremely overprotective of her. But by then, Lori encouraged him to be so. In 2004, between her third and fourth husband, Lori participated in the Miss Texas beauty pageant. She had won the Mrs. Hayes County pageant, and she was now obsessed with becoming Miss America. She was now working as a hairstylist and taking care of her daughter, Tylee. Her son, Colby, had stayed with his dad. Lori made it to the top 15 semifinalists. When the judge asked her, "What makes you tick?" she replied, "Being a good mom is very important to me, and a good wife and a good worker. And being all of those things together isn't easy, so basically, I'm a ticking time bomb." Well, she was a ticking time bomb in the middle of an acrimonious divorce, and this is nothing compared to what would happen next. In late 2005, Lori met Charles Vallow, and as the devout Mormon that she was, she soon married him on February 24th, 2006. Charles also came from a large Mormon family, but he was nowhere near as devout as Lori. However, he cared a lot about family values and staying close to his children. He had 2 sons from a previous marriage, Nicholas and Zachary. And when Lori came to live with him in Arizona, there were 4 kids in the house: Nick, Zach, Tylee, and Colby, who would divide his time between Lori's and his dad's. But remember how Lori would be left alone with her siblings as her parents went on long holidays? Well, she would do the same to her kids. Charles would often be away on business trips, and Lori would leave the house and spend days on end with her family and friends. This meant Charles's sons, Nick and Zach, were left in charge of Colby and Tylee. And in 2014, things would get even more complicated. Lori and Charles decided to adopt Charles's grandnephew, Joshua Jackson, or as everyone called him, JJ. JJ was adopted in 2014. That year, however, both Charles's sons and Lori's son Colby moved out of the house. It was now down to the parents to raise Tylee and JJ. Tylee adored JJ. She was born in 2002 and JJ was born in 2012, so there was a whole decade between them. And Tylee felt almost like a mother to him.
Are you talking about my child?
Your child?
My.
Tylee's friends loved to see them together. Tylee was extremely mature, almost more mature and child-oriented than her own mom.
I loved being around JJ and Tylee. Tylee was really protective over JJ, and she was kind of like another mama to him. JJ, say hi.
Sit down. Happy.
Tylee was so happy, and so was JJ. Sadly, Lori was deeply unhappy, and she would develop an obsession that would kill them both. In December 2014, the Vallow family moved to Hawaii. Lori and Charles tried a fresh start by opening a juice bar, Juice Island. Judging by Lori's social media, you would say she adored spending time with her kids, especially her daughter Tylee. They were always smiling, walking, jogging, and enjoying the natural splendor of the islands. But this would only last 2 years. Lori and Charles's business failed dramatically, and they saw no other choice but to move back to Arizona. Along with this move, Lori's 4th marriage would also come to an end, but the end would be much more dramatic than those before. You see, with every husband, Lori became more Mormon, but by the time she was with Charles, her religion was slowly turning to a cult. When the couple got back to Arizona, Lori was now obsessed with a series of books written by Chad Daybell. Chad became sort of a role model to Lori, someone who she believed spoke the truth. But wait until you hear what she believed. In October 2018, Lori's friend, knowing of her new obsession, took her to a religious event where Chad was speaking.
Ready to preparing a people conference announcement with Chad Daybell, one of our main speakers.
When Chad and Lori started talking, sparks started flying. And Chad, well, he told her they had been married in 7 previous lifetimes. Talk about cheesy pickup lines. Somehow, Lori fell for it, and she also believed him. Chad was born in 1968, 3 years older than Lori, but a whole 12 years younger than Charles. He grew up in Utah and married his high school girlfriend Tammy, with whom he had 5 children. He worked as a gravedigger before opening his own book company, Spring Creek Books. And after proclaiming that God spoke to him, he moved to Rexburg, Idaho, simply following his orders, he said. Also following God's orders, Chad had been hitting on married women, aka Lori. But this was masked by his strange beliefs, which seemed to fascinate Lori. Chad put all people into 2 categories, light and dark. Of course, when he said someone was dark, he meant that they were a follower of Satan. Chad told Lori that she was an eternal being, having been on this earth for 22 lives. And just like him, she had been on planet Earth for 5 previous lives. And incredibly, in all their lives, they were married. Chad even sent Lori a detailed email analyzing her whole family, putting them in dark or light and determining their level. By the end of 2016, Lori was a fierce devotee of Chad, and she was also in love with him. She began referring to dark people as zombies, and she didn't really seem to care about her family anymore. After all, she was an eternal spirit that was going to lead the 144,000, the group with special protection from God himself. Why would such a special person bother with cleaning the house or taking care of the children? On January 31st, 2017, Charles returned home after a week-long business trip. He was a little worried. For the last 2 days, he hadn't gotten through to Lori, Tylee, or JJ. When he arrived at the airport, he went to take his truck home, but the truck was missing. He took a taxi home only to discover the locks had been changed and all his clothes were in the trash. That's not all. $35,000 were also missing from his account. That night, Charles called the police.
So what's going on tonight?
I don't know how to say it. We're LDS. She thinks she's a resurrected being and a God, and remember the 144,000. Jesus is coming next year. She took all the money out of her bank account today. My truck has gone from the airport. She went to the airport and got it. I just flew in from Dallas.
When they entered the garage, they noticed all the family cars had disappeared, along with several valuables. Charles even told the police that Lori had threatened to kill him.
She said, "You're not Charles. I don't know who you are, what you did with Charles, but I can murder you now."
Guess what? The police did nothing. They even criticized Charles for wasting their time. Charles filed for divorce while Lori was AWOL for 58 days. Lori had stayed with Tylee in Hawaii until April when they returned to Arizona. This was the start of a murderous rampage. On July 11th, 2019, the police received a disturbing call.
911, where is your emergency?
I'm in police in an ambulance.
What's the emergency there?
I got in a fight with my brother-in-law and I shot him in self-defense.
And is he hurt? Did he fly?
Yeah, there's blood. He's not moving.
How long ago did this happen?
A couple of minutes.
What's his name, your brother-in-law?
Charles Vallow.
Okay, what part of his body is injured?
In the chest.
I'm sorry, where?
In the chest.
Is he awake and responsive or unconscious?
Unconscious.
Is he breathing?
I can't tell.
Are you willing to go over to him and check?
Sure.
The caller was none other than Alex Cox, Lori's creepy brother. And when the police arrived at the residence, they discovered Charles's body lying in a pool of blood in the living room. The house was empty, bar Charles's lifeless body. Outside, Alex told the police the following story. He and Tylee were waiting at the house when Lori was taking JJ to school. That's when Charles arrived at the house in an aggressive mood. Tylee went to grab the baseball bat, but when she came back with it, Charles grabbed it from her hand and hit Alex on the head with it. So Alex took out his gun and shot Charles multiple times in the chest. But Alex seemed fine. No injuries were visible on his head. When the police looked closer, he had a very tiny mark, almost as if it was self-inflicted. Charles was a semi-pro baseball player. If he'd hit Alex with the baseball bat, Alex could have died. But Charles was also a very peaceful person. He had zero history of getting in physical altercations. And behind the house, Lori and Tylee were chilling.
How long have you lived here?
Like 3 weeks.
Oh, geez. Yeah, okay.
So the neighbors don't last night.
Gotcha.
Like, hi neighbor, sorry.
If the police are looking at a homicide, maybe try to look devastated? Just saying. What's more, Lori threw a massive pool party on the same day that her ex-husband was killed, inside the same house. Honestly, who does that? That same day, Alex was released from custody. The police were somehow pleased with the self-defense shooting theory. On the following day, Lori sent a text to Charles's sons. A text? With news like this, a couple of days later, Lori, Tylee, and JJ moved in with Chad in Rexburg, Idaho, and creepy Alex followed them there. On September 8th, 2019, Lori, Alex, and her 2 kids went to Yellowstone National Park. The following day, JJ started school, but Tylee was nowhere to be found. In fact, the last time anyone saw her was before she went on the Yellowstone trip. On September 17th, JJ was seen outside his Rexburg home, playing with a slightly older friend. After this, JJ seemed to vanish. A couple of days later, Lori went to unenroll him from school. She claimed that she decided to homeschool JJ. No one would ever see the children again. For a few days, no one worried. The family was now in Rexburg, and their extended family assumed they were just getting accustomed to the move. But as the days turned to weeks, JJ's grandparents and Tylee's dad became more and more anxious. Lori wouldn't return their calls, but she would respond with text messages saying the kids were fine and away. Yeah. Every time someone would contact her, she would claim that JJ was with her friend in Arizona and Tylee was at a friend's house, and so on. They were never with her. By November 2019, the kids had been missing for 2 months, and this was the main news in Idaho.
People were interested in the story right from the beginning. We don't normally get missing kids news releases that are like this, and it just continued to get bigger and bigger.
And the main reason was Lori's full uncooperation.
Typically when a missing person is reported, it's the parents that call us. And so when we posted this story, I think people immediately knew that something was fishy.
By November, the FBI got involved, and the case started making national headlines. JJ's grandparents, Larry and Kay, were very involved and concerned.
He was our baby from, just instant fall in love. That's what you do with grandkids. You just fall in love immediately.
JJ was born prematurely, weighing just over 2 pounds, and he was on the autistic spectrum, which meant that he needed special education. His grandparents had stayed very close to him throughout his childhood. But after Charles's death, Lori cut off all communication with them. And even when they begged her to give them 1 hour of Skype time with their grandson, she ignored them. Apparently, Lori was upset that Charles had switched his life insurance beneficiary from Lori to his sister, Kay. It's funny, Lori was upset after she and Alex killed Kay's brother. In late 2016, Kay called the police in Chandler, Arizona to do a welfare check on JJ. That's when the police tracked JJ's family to Idaho. Lori was now living with Chad, but her brother Alex and her niece Melanie were also living in neighboring apartments. When the police spoke to Lori that day, she claimed her kids were both in Arizona.
You're alone, or is that help?
My brother's here.
So JJ would be where?
He's in Arizona.
Who's he with in Arizona?
She's with one of my friends in Arizona.
She also claimed that Tylee was away at college, even though Tylee had never finished high school. Then she complained about Charles's life insurance, completely unprompted. The same day, the police met with Chad. He babbled something about not knowing Lori's phone number. The police decided to get a search warrant for their home. But when they got to the house the next day, Lori and Chad were gone.
There was food in the refrigerator, food in the pantry. Everything had been taken off the hangers, and there was no clothes in the dresser drawers.
Lori's cell phone went straight to voicemail, and Chad never returned any phone calls from the police. When the detectives checked the information Lori had given them about her kids, they discovered it was all lies. Tylee had never enrolled to go to college, or school for that matter, ever since their move to Idaho in August 2019. And Melanie, Lori's friend who reportedly took care of JJ, was only covering for Lori.
She told me that the police had been there asking for JJ, and that she told the police that I had JJ, that I was at a movie called Frozen.
All of her alibis were turning to ashes, but Lori had vanished. Now all her family was pleading for her to reveal the location of Tylee and JJ, even her own son, Colby Ryan.
I'm your son. I would never want anything to happen to you, and I would never want anything to happen to Tylee and JJ ever. I know you know the right thing to do is, and I know that you have a good heart, so I know that It's time to do the right thing.
But Lori was far away from doing the right thing. Now she'd married Chad, her 5th husband, and she was living the good life in Hawaii. By Christmas 2019, the media tracked the couple to Hawaii.
Did you do something to your children? Are your children still alive? That's a simple question. I've got 3 kids of my own. I can tell you every minute where my kids are at. Where are your children? Listen, just tell people what's happening. There's people around the country praying for your children, praying for you guys. Why don't you give us answers?
That's great.
That's great. That's great that they're praying for you, praying for your kids. What? You have nothing to say?
It's infuriating to watch how Tylee and JJ's mom cared less about them than virtually the whole country. Of course, the police got their hands on this video and decided to finally take more serious action. They filed a child protection order.
It instructed her to bring her minor children to the Rexburg Police Department or the Department of Health and Welfare within 5 days of being served.
After 5 days of Lori ignoring the order, she was arrested. Chad sat at her first court hearing just a few rows behind, really focused on what his wife was telling the judge. Outside the courtroom, Lori's extended family was growing ever more outraged at her lack of answers about Tylee and JJ.
This is not about Lori. Guys, this is Lori telling us where those 2 kids are.
At this point, it had been a couple months since anyone had seen JJ and Tylee, and it didn't look like their parents cared, and she wasn't willing to say anything.
With Lori in custody, the police were now investigating Charles's death too. Remember how cool Alex and Lori were, and how Lori threw a party on the same day Charles was killed inside her home?
That was the most bull story that I have ever heard in my life. That was a setup, a absolute setup murder for hire.
And as the detectives were digging through suspicious stories, in came another one. Chad's ex-wife Tammy had just died under suspicious circumstances.
Suddenly, Tammy Daybell, Chad's first wife, passes away in her sleep. Now, this is a 49-year-old woman. She's an avid runner, and according to her friends and family, was in good health, seemed to be in good spirits around the time of her death, which really raised a lot of eyebrows.
Chad and Tammy had been married for 28 years, until Lori came along. When the detectives spoke to Chad's friends and family, they discovered that over the previous months, he kept saying he had visions of his wife dying. When the police asked him if he wanted an autopsy performed, he declined. And at Tammy's funeral, he behaved pretty strangely.
He recited many things that were not asked for concerning the details of her death. He told us what happened to her that morning. He told us that she had since been to visit him and is helping him set affairs in order, giving him direction on how to handle certain children in their future.
What's more, Chad was upbeat and jolly throughout the whole funeral. He also left early, which for a husband of almost 3 decades seemed pretty strange to everyone. And 10 days later, he eloped to Hawaii with his new love, Lori. On November 5th, 2019, they got married. As the police were closing in on arresting Chad too, they discovered a phone call between him and Lori's friend, Melanie.
Tammy had been getting weaker and sick, and I begged her to go to the doctor. Her heart was failing her. She was physically falling apart. She hates doctors, so she just passed away.
Here's where it gets even creepier. 17 days before Tammy's death, Lori used Charles's credit card to order matching wedding rings for her and Chad. So this was premeditated. But Chad's whole selling point was that he had visions.
In the LDS faith, it is accepted for a person to have visions, and Chad was known for his sixth sense of things that may come or may not come. It was a way really for him to connect with other like-minded members of the Mormon church to join together with him and share this common special ground.
So Chad was adamant he knew his wife would die, as he told all his concerned friends. And the detectives would discover that Lori had also become a part of his religion/cult over the last year. They would appear together in podcasts, discussing how they should prepare for the apocalypse and how they were special people, part of the 144,000.
We're gathering together as saints, as brothers and sisters, and preparing for the second coming of Christ.
But how do you get from doomsday cults to killing your whole family? The detectives were still nowhere near the location of Tylee and JJ, but as they were digging through Lori's history, they discovered a sad truth. Charles had warned the police many times about Lori and even confessed he was scared for his life.
She said, "You're not Charles. I don't know who you are, what you did with Charles, but I can murder you now." I've tried to support her as much as I could, but it's gotten really, really bad. Lately, she's had a break. She says, "I'm Nick Schneider. I've taken over Charles's body, and Charles has been killed. I'm going to kill you. You're going to be murdered today or tomorrow. I can do it. I'm not going to priesthood power. She has priesthood blessing."
The police had many chances to intervene and perhaps even save Charles's life, but at the time, they didn't take his pleas seriously enough. In March 2020, 6 months after Tylee and JJ's disappearance, the FBI asked people in Idaho to send any pictures of them that they had the day the kids vanished. They discovered that Alex Cox was there on both days, September 8th and 22nd.
He was staying with Alex, and Alex brought him home and carried him to bed.
Melanie and her husband David stayed at Lori's home that night. The next morning, Alex and JJ were gone.
She said that he was being a zombie and climbed up on the cabinets, climbed up on top of the fridge, smashed her picture of Christ down, and then climbed up onto the upper cabinets.
That's called a 7-year-old on the autistic spectrum, not a zombie. But Lori claimed her son was a zombie, so Alex had to take him away. Then remember Melanie, Lori's niece, who had come to stay in a neighboring apartment in Rexburg? She was about to divorce her husband, Brandon, when Brandon was almost killed in his car. The shooter's car was registered to Charles Fallow, who was already dead at this point. Brandon said he was almost certain Alex Cox was driving the car.
He knew that Alex Cox was kind of the family hitman. And he just fairly quickly came to the conclusion that it was Alex Cox.
Around the same time, Lori and an unidentified man were seen loading a storage unit in Idaho. And 10 days before Tammy died, she posted something very distressing on Facebook. Someone also shot at her in the driveway and tried to kill her. Was Alex doing Lori's darkest bidding, trying to kill her entire family? On December 12th, there was a huge plot twist. The police were just getting an arrest warrant ready for Alex Cox when a family friend called to say he'd just died in his bathroom.
Hi, I need an ambulance. I have a older male here named Alex. He just passed out here on my bathroom.
Alex died of a pulmonary embolism on the same day that the police exhumed Tammy's body. On June 9th, 2020, Rexburg police and the FBI showed up at Chad's home with a search warrant. This was the second search they were conducting, but the previous one was half a year before, when the snow was covering the frozen ground. This time, they would dig Chad's back garden with ease.
I observed the evidence response recovery team and also cadaver dogs working the entire backyard. So they worked the pond area, and then they had marked off other areas inside the backyard.
Before long, the forensic team discovered fresh sod on top of rocks on top of some paneling.
As soon as they removed the paneling, I could smell the odor of a decomposing body.
JJ's decomposed body was wrapped in plastic and buried in Chad's backyard. Now, the police knew Tylee was also buried somewhere. So they went to the local pet cemetery. Almost a year ago, Chad had sent a series of very weird texts to his then wife, Tammy.
Chad says to his then alive wife, Tammy, "Well, I've had an interesting morning. I felt we should burn all of the limb debris by the fire pit before it got too soaked by the coming storms. While I did so, I spotted a big raccoon along the fence and I hurried and got my gun, and he was still walking along. I got close enough that one shot did the trick. He's now in our pet cemetery. Fun times. That's how Chad decided to alert his wife that she might see some action around the cemetery.
Yeah. That was not a raccoon. When the forensic team dug up the cemetery, they found the dismembered body of Tylee. That day, Lori called Chad from prison.
Are you okay? The house?
Yeah.
Were they in the house?
No, they're out to the property.
Are they seizing stuff again?
It was pretty clear they both knew this was the end for their psychopathic stint. A few hours later, Chad was in custody. Finally, JJ and Tylee's family knew what had happened to them, but it was heartbreaking. The whole story is outrageous. Lori fell in love with a cult leader, took on his beliefs, and then the couple decided to kill their current partners. But what about their children? What was their motivation there? Well, they were zombies. Yeah, Lori was heard saying that both JJ and Tylee, that they were zombies. In a heartbreaking twist, Tylee herself had heard her mom talk on the phone and call her a zombie. Lori was so far gone that she didn't love her children anymore. She just saw them as evil beings who needed to go. Chad and Lori are both charged with murder, but it's unclear who exactly killed the children. Lori, Chad, and Alex were at the Rexburg residence on both occasions, Tylee's and JJ's disappearance. Anyone could be guilty, but Alex passed away, so he can't confess. And it's likely Chad and Lori will just pin the blame on him. But there's evidence that Chad buried both of them, and both his and Lori's behavior in the 11 months people were looking for the kids shows they knew what happened. Lori and Chad were a match made in hell, but all the while they preached they were the chosen ones. It's truly devastating to think so many innocent people met horrible deaths because of these two people's delusions. In April 2023, Chad and Lori will be tried separately for the murders of JJ, Tylee, and Tammy. According to the police, there is now DNA evidence that both Chad and Lori were responsible for these murders. Of course, both pleaded not guilty. Will there be enough evidence to convict the two? If they are, both Chad and Lori could face the death penalty in Idaho. But no matter their sentences, it's unlikely they will bring any closure to all the people that were left heartbroken by this horrific, outrageous story.
No, as Rachel would not be away this long without contacting someone. And we do know that wherever she is, that she's not there by choice.
Can I take a picture?
This is 18-year-old Rachel Berkheimer. She'd gone through a tough year, but she was starting to find happiness again. Her family was happy for her. They had always supported her, no matter what she chose to do. She was a shining star until a terrible person stole that away. He manipulated her into a terrifying relationship that would end in the worst way imaginable. This is the full story of Rachel Berkheimer. Rachel Berkheimer called the 22,000-acre Tulap Reservation in Snohomish County, Washington, her home. She lived, worked, and went to high school there. On September 27, 2002, 18-year-old Rachel told her parents she was driving a friend to the airport, but she never got back home. By the end of the day, her family reported her missing. The Berkheimer family rallied together and distributed missing person posters everywhere in the Snohomish and King counties. They wanted to help law enforcement as much as possible. Detectives received tons of tips. However, you know how it goes with tips. 90% of them are usually dismissible, and you have to spend hours pursuing each one until you can cross it out. Still, this wasn't New York City. Rachel lived in a fairly small community. People her age knew each other, and their parents knew about their everyday affairs too. So the first break in the case was when a tip was received from someone identifying herself as Jeffrey Barth's mother. Jeffrey's mother told the officers to look for a red Jeep registered to Matthew Durham. The 17-year-old was arrested just a few days after Rachel's disappearance. He was interrogated by Sergeant Scott Fenter of the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office. The sergeant didn't have time for teenagers' lies. He knew exactly how to pressure him into speaking.
Matthew Durham's vehicle was used to transport Rachel and some of the other defendants up into the mountains where she was ultimately killed and buried.
He needed to throw other people under the bus fast if he didn't want to be the only one arrested for snatching and killing Rachel. Scott Fentner also appealed to his humane side.
Confronted him with the fact that I believed he knew where Rachel was and that he would be the one that could bring her home.
In less than an hour, Matthew Durham started talking. He even led the detectives to the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. There, they found a shallow gravesite off Ryder Road, east of Gold Bar. In early October, Rachel's remains were found.
We just found what was human flesh.
Matthew proceeded to tell the detectives what had happened in a certain garage on September 27th. It was stomach-turning. Matthew seemed remorseful. He said he was ordered by John Diggy Anderson to drive his vehicle to a remote spot near Ryder Pit, a popular place for off-road vehicles, where he was told to drive down a dirt road. Matthew also told investigators that Diggy told him where to stop. Then, Diggy carried the duffel bag into the woods where he could hear him say, "Get on your knees," and then heard gun sounds and saw muzzle flashes. When they all returned to the vehicle, Matthew was ordered not to speak of the horrific event, or he would face the same fate. That day, 8 people were linked to Rachel's gruesome death. Among them were her boyfriend and her best friend.
Get Brandon. Yeah, Brandon's never been filmed.
Rachel Berkheimer was born in Everett, Snohomish County in 1984. She didn't start talking until she was 3 years old. Her parents thought she might be deaf, but once she started talking, she became the star of the family.
I honestly think that she just was born with that incredible spirit. I do.
She had a big imagination, was good at imitations, and had a range of funny voices that kept her family amused and entertained. Her dad, Bill, said, "She was so theatrical and creative. I think that's how she lived her life. I don't want to say it was a fantasy, but it was kind of like she was a character in a bigger cast or of some ongoing saga." Rachel's family described her as funny, giving, and a prankster. Her smile could light up any room, and her kindness stood out, especially for someone her age. She never forgot a birthday and randomly sent cards to her family and friends, telling them she loved them. She was outgoing and made friends easily, even organizing a baby shower for a coworker who was only a casual acquaintance.
Are you gonna take a picture?
Rachel's mom, Denise, also had a lot of fond memories of her.
She's just so precious, such a special person. Always bubbly and happy.
I was the rebel rouser, and she was the good girl.
I read that she was very athletic, that at 6 years old she could outshoot the boys in the basketball court.
She was like a little bullet, and everybody's going, "Who is that girl?"
Rachel's energy stood in stark contrast to her height. She stood at just 4'11". Her family saw her as a future performer.
She very well could have been on stage or had a great career in that regard.
She always had big dreams, and she wanted to be a veterinarian. She loved animals. She wanted to be an actress.
But in 2001, Rachel said she wanted to become a medical technician. Her family supported whatever she wanted to do. They knew that whatever goal she chose, she would give it her all, and she would shine at it. But that year, everything changed for Rachel. In August 2001, Rachel lost one of her best friends, Corey Haynes, in a horrific rollover car accident. She took the death extremely hard and, in her grief, attached his pictures all over her Subaru dashboard and room. She hung his obituary on her bedroom wall.
She wasn't her happy, bubbly self, and she was suffering tremendously from grief.
Corey and Rachel were never romantically involved, but they saw each other as soulmates.
They were the classic soulmates. It was a brother-sister relationship. He was an amazing young man.
They spent every day together. They shared all their secrets with each other. It was like losing her twin brother.
It was truly like a transformation that was happening before our eyes. It was, the Rachel that I knew was very much changing in her priorities.
Then came even more tragedies. In a shocking twist, in just 1 year, Rachel lost 6 friends. And their causes of death were all horrible. She was just 17 at the time. Imagine losing this many people in these ways in such a short time frame. Rachel's sister Megan said, "It was so hard. I think it killed her, literally. She just became so heartbroken. You could see it in her eyes. Her light was gone." In just a few months, Rachel went from a studious, passionate girl with big dreams to a detached, addicted, vulnerable teen, prone to the worst kind of influence. Although her parents took her to see a therapist, Rachel did not continue her sessions, and she decided to drop out of school too. She started attending an alternative school but dropped out from there too. At that time, she also had a job at Jimmy's Pizza and Pasta. She continued her job after dropping out from school for another month or so. Then, she quit that too. Sadly, Rachel also drifted away from her family.
Did you feel helpless?
I did because, I would try to talk to her and try to connect with her and sympathize with her and advise her, as we do as sisters. And I felt unsuccessful.
Instead of seeking support from her parents and sister, Rachel retreated into her own world, and then she sought comfort elsewhere. Rachel started using white powder and amphetamine. Bill would regularly confront her about her use and urge her to get a new job or enroll in school again. But all the arguments would end the same way, with Rachel retreating into her own room or leaving the house. Then, Rachel found herself a boyfriend. Well, to call him a boyfriend would be too nice. He was the scum of the earth. John Anderson had been in and out of jail all his life. Now he was part of a small gang of users and thieves. Detective Brad Pintz said the gang was kind of in the infant stages.
It was a real stupid name. They called themselves the Northwest Mafia. They'd steal, they'd sell some of them and use most of it.
How could Rachel even come in contact with this guy?
What did she tell you about John Anderson when she met him?
She didn't tell me anything about John Anderson. I found out about John Anderson pretty much the hard way.
What was the hard way? A shocking phone bill.
I got a phone bill one day for $640. I look at this phone bill, I'm in shock. It says Correctional Facility, Shelton, Washington.
It's unclear whether Rachel met John before he was sent to prison again, or while he was an inmate. In any case, he had inserted himself into her life forcefully and manically. From the very beginning of their so-called relationship, he was alarmingly possessive and obsessed with her. He would write her jealous letters, despairing over the thought of seeing her with other guys.
I don't know any other way of showing you that you are so special. To me, I would murder 1,000,000 people if I had to, just to be with you.
Like any worried parent, Bill confronted his daughter.
She kept talking about how she saw the good in him and he wasn't what people think he is.
You referred to John as being her bad boy, like every girl dates a bad boy, and that's how you...
That's what I thought. I thought this is her bad boy.
Did she not see his behavior and criminal record as a huge red flag? But John wasn't the bad guy from the 1990s teenage movies, the high schooler dressed in black smoking behind the school. He was a criminal with severe rage and jealousy issues. Once out of jail, he would sniff Rachel's hair and clothes just to make sure she hadn't seen other men. Rachel's sister Megan saw bruises on her. When she asked her about them, Rachel didn't want to talk about it, but Megan knew she was in too deep, and she was afraid of John by now. According to Rachel's friends, in 2002, she was trapped in a love-hate roller coaster with John Anderson. It was a hot-cold situation, and these are, in many respects, the worst. If it's just cold, you know you have to get out. But when he's warm and cuddly too, you end up yearning for those moments and enduring the horrible ones. Quick note, don't! If they're like that, run! Finally, as summer turned to fall in 2002, Rachel was beginning to see the end of her relationship.
She sat on the end of my bed and she was talking to me until 2 a.m. about her fears, about her concerns, about John Anderson and the different threats that he had been giving her.
The Berkheimers were over the moon. They could see Rachel was coming to her senses. They even saw her blossom again, if only a little bit.
The two of you started to spend time together, going to church.
Yes.
Things were changing for her?
And she seemed to be more normal, and She'd come over and visit me and call, and we just had a regular relationship again, and it was nice.
Rachel's sister, Megan, had a toddler, and Rachel was finally spending time with them again. But Rachel made new friends outside of her family too.
One morning, a beautiful sunny morning, she's sitting on our porch, and she has this radiance again that I've not seen for a few months. And she looked up and said, I have met an incredible friend. His name is Maurice.
18-year-old Maurice Rivas was also a member of the Northwest Mafia, but just like Rachel, he wanted out. Together, they made a bond in their goal to break free.
Maurice Rivas was 18 years old. He also grew up in a troubled home. I think his closest relative was a grandmother. He was in the foster kid system for several years.
She said, we've decided we're going to go back to school. We're going to go graduate. We're going to walk with our class, and we're going to do it right.
Sounded amazing. If she wouldn't listen to her family, she at least listened to her new friend. It seemed like she was on the right track to healing and getting away from John. But they never anticipated how John would react to her decision. As Rachel was pulling away, John was attempting to win back her affection. Sadly, Rachel fell for it.
I thought, this is just a phase. A lot of teenagers go through this. She'll get out of it.
Then they temporarily broke up again, and Rachel started dating one of John's friends.
She was a party girl. She wanted to have fun. She wanted everybody around her to have fun.
But if John Anderson was frighteningly jealous when he had no reason, imagine what he felt now that his ex was trying out his fellow gang members. In an attempt to get other gang members to turn on Rachel, John told them that Rachel was passing on gang secrets to her friends. With this, he signed her death sentence. In September, Rachel asked her sister for advice. Someone in the gang had told her there was a on her head.
I told her, okay, look, you need to be aware. You need to be cautious. Stay away from him, for sure. But I just thought, he's some dumb young punk.
Megan didn't take John seriously. She genuinely believed if Rachel stayed away from him, he wouldn't come after her. At the end of September, Rachel attended a party at Everett Duplex. 7 people from the gang were there. Rachel was getting ready to leave that group, but she thought it was a good tactic to appear as though she was still loyal to them. Since they were now convinced she was sort of a traitor, she felt she had to prove otherwise before she cut ties with them for good.
They were all sitting around the couch having fun, tickling, giggling.
Later in the evening, John arrived at the party. Instead of joining in, he watched disgusted from afar. He was annoyed at how much fun people were having with Rachel. First, he took his anger out on a couple of the younger teens by smacking them. Within a few seconds, things got so heated that weapons were pulled out and pointed at each other. Rachel tried to leave, but as soon as John saw her, he pulled her back. He hit her repeatedly and then roped 2 other teenage boys to do the same. She was in the head over and over again. Instead of helping, someone else turned the stereo louder so that no one else could hear her screams.
They scooped up Rachel, took her out to the garage, gagged her and taped her so she couldn't scream anymore.
Then John and his friends started discussing plans. Should they all attack her in that garage? Or should they ask her dad for ransom money? They decided on neither. Instead, they ordered pizza, played video games, and got high. Meanwhile, Rachel was crying all by herself on the garage floor. Suddenly, the homeowner, Trista Connor, entered the garage and saw Rachel. Trista was the girlfriend of someone else in the gang, but she had no idea about what had just happened.
She went back to the kitchen to get a knife to try and get her hands and feet loose.
But John saw Trista and realized what she was trying to do, so he flew into a rage at her. Trista threatened to call 911, but the boys threatened her harder, and she backed down. By now, they had a plan. They stuffed Rachel in a duffel bag and put her in the trunk of his Jeep. Someone suggested leaving her in a hotel room to heal. All Rachel could do is try and listen from the trunk and hope they showed her mercy. Remember her new bestie, Maurice? He did not intervene once to protect Rachel or save her from that garage. In fact, Maurice got into the car with John and 2 other boys. The 4 of them drove Rachel to the foothills of the Cascade Mountains. Once they parked, John and his 2 friends left to go get shovels. Shockingly, he left Maurice to guard Rachel. Even more shockingly, Maurice agreed, even though he knew perfectly well what getting shovels meant.
Told him that she knew that she was going to die and that she begged him that if that was the case, that she didn't want to be.
Maurice had several minutes to save Rachel's life, but he made no effort. Instead, he told her to calm down and that it wouldn't come to that. Did he genuinely refuse to see the evil side of his friends? Or was he so brainwashed into submission that he couldn't fathom going against John's word? Was he that afraid of him? When John and the others came back, they started digging. Someone put the duffel bag next to the hole they were digging, and John hit the bag with the shovel as hard as he could. But Rachel was still alive and conscious. Maurice was smoking and drinking a soda in the car, trying not to look at the scene. Then, John called him out and he came. As Maurice began helping with the digging, John told one of the other boys to take Rachel out of the bag and remove her clothes and jewelry. Rachel insisted that she do this herself.
They removed all of her rings and her necklace. She begged them to let her keep one ring that was given to her by a friend of hers that was killed in a car wreck. Anderson told her hell no.
In one last attempt to keep her dignity, Rachel said she would walk to her grave instead of getting dragged there. She got down on her knees and started to pray.
Anderson told her not to worry about it, that she'd be up there with him soon.
He was referring to her soulmate, Corey. Rachel watched her own grave being dug by someone who claimed that he loved her. Then the same man, together with someone she called her best friend, unalived her and threw her in. By the early days of October, when Rachel's remains were found and Matthew Durham was arrested, this was officially a homicide case. Rachel's family was devastated, but they knew they had to carry on to bring justice for their daughter.
For the Berkheimers, pure devastation.
I just knew it. I could just feel her presence gone.
Matthew led the officers to the burial site as well as the Everett duplex where it all happened. The evidence was overwhelming.
Bullets found at the gravesite matches this pistol, the gun that Rachel.
There were weapons, duct tape, jewelry belonging to Rachel, and her clothing that the gang tried to burn. Within a few days, 8 suspects were arrested. Proving how cowardly they were, they started turning on each other, hoping to get out of punishment themselves. So much for loyalty, which they claimed they took Rachel's life for.
They were really buffoons. That's the best way to describe them. There was a lot of planning that went into this, but it was very poor planning and it didn't turn out well for them.
Buffoons that took an innocent life for the fun of it, and buffoons that did what a sociopathic maniac told them to without so much as questioning it. They all had so many opportunities not to join in, and yet they turned the music louder and partook until the very end. It's truly heartbreaking how little brain or empathy some people can have. 5 of the 8 took plea deals in exchange for a trial testimony. Nathan Lovelace received 30 days in prison, Tony Williams 9 years, and Jeffrey Barth 10 years. Durham, the first to be arrested, was sentenced to 26 years in prison, and Rachel's so-called friend, Maurice Rivas, received an equal sentence. John Whitaker helped dig Rachel's grave that night. He and John Anderson were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Yusuf Jihad was sentenced to 37 years for accompanying John on that trip and organizing the plan together with John. Imagine the Berkheimers' experience as they sat through 3 trials, all of which went over the stomach-turning details of Rachel's demise. Finally, it was time for the judge to address John Anderson.
Take a long, hard look around this courtroom today. This is the last group of decent, honorable, and free people you will ever see the rest of your life.
Rachel's family could not comprehend how arrogant and emotionless these men were.
Most of them were smug, and John Anderson was by far the worst. He was definitely mocking he would turn around and wink at us. I would always go into that courtroom with the feeling that I'm the closest physical resemblance there is to her. And I want them to look at me, and I want them to see her. And I want it to haunt them.
Rachel's dad, Bill, said the sentences they received are not a win, just the end of a process. From then on, they could start healing. However, there can be little healing or solace when you think of Rachel's last year. First, she lost 6 friends, including someone she saw as her soulmate. Then her new best friends betrayed her, all of them.
Every person involved in this case had an opportunity to help Rachel, and they let her down.
When True Crime Daily reached John Anderson for an in-person interview, he replied with an incredibly narcissistic email. You may think that I'm the average self-absorbed criminal who thinks only about self, and that you can play off of that to get me to say whatever. He painted himself as a misunderstood victim and accused the journalist of trying to manipulate him. But painting yourself as a victim is a form of manipulation itself. No one wanted him to say whatever, just his version of things. This was happening 2 decades after Rachel's death. It's crazy that not even now, John isn't ready to apologize. Maurice, however, accepted the invitation to a phone interview.
It was really senseless, and it didn't need to happen, and it was just a horrible, horrible thing. A lot of it was fear. It just kept gripping me. That I was like, man, I was just really scared in a lot of points. I know that's like cowardice. I failed on an epic scale.
He's right, but this does nothing for Rachel's family now.
There is no closure. There is no... I'm trying to minimize my time in a emotional correctional facility. I'll never forget, I did see a photo of the gravesite, and there was, in the dirt, was an imprint of her hands in a praying position, perfectly preserved. And that gives me some peace.
But the Berkheimers didn't crumble into non-existence. Instead, Bill is working to raise awareness around other victims by working on legislation that would make it a crime to not render care for an injured person. On September 25th, 2007, the National Day of Remembrance for Murder Victims was held at the Capitol in Olympia, Washington. On that day, Bill presented a moving and raw declaration to the crowd attending. Insidious grief and pain are a direct result of losing a loved one to murder. This day shall be a day of grief relief. All survivors get a one-day pass on pain, and no monsters can whisper in their ears. Some ignorant people who are shallow and narrow-minded enough to believe families who have had a loved one murdered have some kind of communicable disease will on this day finally realize that murder is not contagious. Furthermore, no doctor will think they can prescribe grief pills. There is no such thing. Crime victim organizations and support groups struggle to obtain adequate funding to maintain their vital role in our communities, and whose tireless efforts by dedicated and committed people bring strength and courage to friends and families of violent crime, shall on this day receive enough funding to effectively operate forever, or until there is no more violent crime, whichever comes first. The only way to move past something like this is to try to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. By helping others, Rachel's family is coping with a loss that will never make sense. Thanks for watching, you guys. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you know similar stories? Let me know in a comment below. And before you go, make sure you like, subscribe, and hit that bell button. See you next time.